Hello everyone, and welcome to the Mooting Society's interview series, where we interview some of the best legal professionals in the region. My name is Helya Banihashemi, and I am a law student. Today I'm here with one of the best arbitrators in the region and internationally, Ms. Anne Hoffmann. Hello, Ms. Hoffmann. How are you? Thank you for accepting our invitation to be on our series. Would you please, before we start with the conversation and to learn more about your career, introduce yourself and give us a brief background about yourself, just so our audience get to know you more?
Of course, thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me. I'm an independent arbitrator based here in Dubai. I practice commercial and investment law. I am a dual qualified practitioner. I'm qualified in Germany and in England and Wales. I worked in various jurisdictions. I qualified in Germany, moved to London, practiced in Geneva, and then about 11 years ago came to Dubai.
That's great. So we know that you're very deeply in the field of arbitration. And speaking of that, would you just tell us what really, brought you into this field and sparked your interest in arbitration?
That was my master's. So when after I had done what we call the first state exam in Germany, I moved to London to do my master's at University College London. And when I was requested to choose 4 courses, I went through the course program and found a course that was called International Arbitration. I had no idea what that was, but I thought it looked interesting, and found myself at the London School of International Arbitration at Queen Mary, taught by Professor Julian Liu, who is an icon in the field. And after 3 or 4 sessions, I realized that I had fallen in love and found what I wanted to do for the rest of my life.
That's wonderful to know. I mean, it's really interesting how you've had several notable achievements over your career. I mean, you weren't just acting as an arbitrator, but you were also an author and also an educator at some point, and also a speaker at some keynote events. So I'm aware that there's so many students currently that want to venture into these different fields of the profession, but also want to have a focused career trajectory. So what advice would you really give them? I mean, you've really experienced it all. So what advice would you have for those students?
I think it's very difficult to give advice, to someone who's starting out in the field. I'm aware that, things have become very competitive, especially in the field of arbitration. When I started out about 25 years ago, there was a few of us, and now I know it's become very popular. Generally, I would say follow your heart and do something you're passionate about. And if you have your heart or your mind set to doing something in particular, then don't give up, even if it's hard and if it's not always easy and the road doesn't always seem to be straight, but sometimes has a curve. You never know what it's good for. You never know why certain things, might be helpful later in life. When they happen, you don't know. I've always looked back and thought, now this is becoming useful, or now this acquaintance I made, or this internship I had, is becoming relevant for something. Yeah. And be patient. When we're young, I'm not so sure that still applies to me. We tend to be very impatient and want everything immediately, and sometimes it takes time for things to come.
And sometimes they get disappointed if they don't get the result right then and there. But I think one thing we can take away from you is patience really gets you to where you want to be. I mean, even with maintaining like a focused career trajectory, because sometimes it gets difficult and challenging when you get into a certain field. Like you start really branching out from where you're really starting, and then they find it difficult to go back to where they actually started. I mean, did you face any challenges like that? Like when you moved into becoming an educator part-time, or like, ventured into these different fields? Was it difficult for you? Did you face any challenges?
I'm not sure I faced challenges, with those different aspects of my professional life. Having authored articles and book contributions is something I like doing. I enjoy that. And so it came almost naturally. I think I started late in terms of writing. You know, I was encouraged by people to do it who thought, you know, it's time for me to try. Similar with speaking. I think, you know, I had challenges, not so much in those aspects, but just, you know, moving from one law firm to the other, or making my next step after I'd started out in London and spent 5 years there and then wasn't so sure anymore that I wanted to stay there. The question was, where do I go next?
Right.
Those things were challenging, yes.
You mentioned moving from law firm to another. I mean, you had the experience of working both at an international law firm like Hyde & Co. and also at a regional powerhouse like El Tamimi. What would you say were the key takeaways from working in these two very different workspaces and work ethic systems? You know, like, what would you share in terms of like your experience and also the advice you would give to students that are trying to decide between going into more like a bigger international firm rather than like a boutique regional firm?
I'm not sure, again, that there's any sort of ready advice I have. I do think it, you know, there's different courses or different, you know, there's the saying, horses for courses. You know, different law firms, different size law firms, law firms with different focus offer different things for different people.
Right.
So I think it's important that you know what you want, but it's also important that you look around and see which of those places can support you best in getting where you wanted to be. So long before I came here, I'd already, you know, practiced for at least 15 or so years before I moved to this region. So my formative years I spent elsewhere, and I spent in other places. And again, though, these were large law firms. I was at there, which, you know, was one of those very famous international law firms that focused on arbitration. That they don't exist anymore. I worked at the London Bar, and then I worked at a Swiss law firm with a very good arbitration department and famous arbitrators. So for me, all of this was right at that time. And so I think it depends, you know, when you look where you're going, it depends that you find the people who you want to work with, because there's nothing worse than not liking to go in the morning to work because you don't like your colleagues. Right. You know, the kind of work they have and they do, the fact, do they want to support you? Are they willing to train you? Is there a certain degree of mentorship available? Right. Those things I think are more important than looking immediately at, okay, it's big, it's small, you know. There might be different advantages to all of those.
Right. And about advantages, I mean, you are a polyglot. You speak multiple languages. You speak English, French, Russian, and German. And would you say it really gave you an upper hand, or it gave you an advantage, the language skills that you owned? I mean, you, whether internationally when you were in different parts of the world or even here in this region, what would you say about that?
Yes, certainly. I think the more languages to speak, you better. I try to encourage my children to learn languages. I do think speaking different languages opens your horizons, opens you up to different worlds, new cultures. Right. I think people think differently in different languages. Right. And I think maybe not so much with English, because, you know, English is very widely spoken, and there's almost an expectation that today people who work in an international field speak English. Maybe also not so much with French, because especially also here there's a lot of people who speak French, but definitely with slightly more exotic languages, if I can call it that, which I would include Russian into, which isn't widely spoken by people outside of those countries. I do find that people embrace you more when you all of a sudden, you know, are able to speak their language. Mm-hmm. There's a certain assumption that you have an understanding for their culture, because that comes with learning a language very often. And I have over the years had, you know, a number of occasions, advantages, especially in this professional field here and elsewhere, being able to speak languages. For example, you know, when I was a junior associate, I was sent to Russia to settle a case because the American partner didn't speak anything but English and didn't get very far, and thought maybe someone speaking the language of the people he was talking to would help, and it did. Yeah. But I've also accepted appointments as arbitrator where, for example, documents were in a different language, and the fact that you as an arbitrator, even though the arbitration is in English, might be able to understand the documents in the original form, has led to appointments. And so I do think, apart from that it opens your horizons, and it's always a good thing to speak languages. There are benefits to speaking different languages.
You mentioned cultures. That brings me to our diversity-related questions. I mean, you've been part of committees on diversity and also spoken on diversity several times. I mean, you are a female arbitrator in the region, and it's been something that you've really focused on in your career. Do you think that there are certain aspects of arbitration or certain regions where arbitration faces challenges in terms of diversity and, really embracing it?
Well, I think arbitration in general benefits and would benefit more from increased diversity, and we're talking about gender diversity, of course, but we're also talking about ethnical diversity, so arbitrators from different parts of the world, because as much as arbitration is an international game, there are differences in how things are done in various regions, and of course, again, we come back to culture. You come with a certain understanding of of the region you come from, so that helps, of course. And I do think diversity is important. I do think it's challenged generally in arbitration. It is even, I think, more difficult in investor-state investment arbitration. You find even less women than you find in general commercial arbitration. But I also do think that that's changing, and I've seen it changing, and I do think even from the time when I started out as an independent arbitrator some years ago to now, I do think there is an increased diversity noticeable. And I think as much as there's still to be done, I can see the progress, and that's a good thing.
I mean, you've worked in different regions of the world. Do you think that there is a specific region that still, needs to embrace it more, or like it was more challenging for you as a female arbitrator specifically? Because I'm pretty sure many of the students that we have are looking into getting into arbitration, and they're female students, and they're just wondering, do I even have a space? Is it really a room? There's room for me in that sense? Do you think you faced anything like that?
I've been asked that question a lot when I first moved to the Middle East as a German and as a
stereotype,
Western.
yeah.
Exactly, the stereotype where everybody assumes that when you move to the Middle East, you have to dress a certain way and you can't say anything, and as a woman you're sidelined. And I have to say, I didn't have that experience at all. Now, I appreciate that I live in Dubai, and the Middle East is not a block, and things are different in different parts of the Middle East. But I did never have any particular challenges, for example, in the Middle East, as compared to, for example, Switzerland. What I used to tell people is I've met chauvinists in Switzerland, and I've met chauvinists in the Middle East, and I've met them everywhere in this world. You don't need to go to a particular place to find them.
They're everywhere.
They're everywhere, but on the other hand, they are also very supportive people everywhere. And so I don't think there's a generalization I would like to make. I think, there's still things to be done in many regions of this world when it comes to arbitration, but the Middle East, at least when it comes to diversity, I would include, this part of the world in having made big advantage or big strides to reach the goals we have in that regard.
That's very, I think, inspiring for everyone watching. I mean, looking into getting into arbitration or even any career in law. I mean, to hear it from someone as successful as you in the field of arbitration. Which I think this question, you're one of the best people I could ask. I mean, being in arbitration for so long, you would know and you'd be able to pinpoint exactly what kind of skills would make a very good arbitrator, and some skills or some characteristic traits that really aren't suitable for being an arbitrator or being in arbitration. What's something you think, maybe using it in a different field of law would be more suitable, but not arbitration? Would you be able to pinpoint anything like that?
I'm not so sure I can pinpoint a particular trait that is required in arbitration but not in other fields of law, or vice versa. I do think generally as an arbitrator or any lawyer, you should be able to listen. I think a lot of people would benefit from more listening than speaking. I do think that arbitration in particular, being a good arbitrator, requires listening on the one hand, but also requires, and I take for granted good legal skills, applying the law, et cetera, research. These are things which I think, again, go for every lawyer. Being a good arbitrator, apart from, those things, being organized, there are project management skills, which I sometimes think are underrated when you're an arbitrator, and in particular when you're a sole arbitrator or you're the chair of the tribunal. It isn't just about the law. It is about running this case and keeping a ship together where you have to deal with two co-arbitrators who might not necessarily be your best friends. You may or may not get on with them. They may or may not get on with each other.
Right.
And then you have two parties or more parties and their lawyers, etc. And so sometimes what I think is underestimated is the sort of skill of keeping all of this together, making sure that things stay on track. And making sure that the arbitration progresses, in addition to the normal legal skills and whatever else is required from a lawyer. But I'm not so sure arbitration is different in that regard from other legal areas or so. So I'm not so sure I can pinpoint to something where if you have that, you better go into a different legal field.
I mean, it's very interesting you mentioned the fact of listening more than speaking, because misunderstanding that many newer students that are getting into law have is that, oh, I'm good at speaking, so I should probably consider law or something like that. But hearing that from you, it's very important for students to know that listening is a more important, maybe even skill than...
I think listening generally comes before speaking. I mean, I do see the point of being, able to speak in public. We met at the Bismuth. I think moots are important to practice your skills of being able to argue a case, convince people. Of course, all of those things are important. But before that, you need to listen in order to understand what your client wants and in order to understand what your client's case is. And so that then translates into building a strategy and making legal arguments. That comes then afterwards. So all of this is important, but I do feel that sometimes listening is underrated.
That's very good to know. Hopping and circling back right to the beginning of our conversation, you mentioned that you got into arbitration after pursuing your postgraduate degree in London. I feel like there's so many students that are grappling between the decision of either getting right into qualifying as soon as they graduate from their undergraduate degree or pursuing a postgraduate degree and then following through with the qualification. With your experience, what would you think is the better option? Or let's not make it that black and white. Would you make the same decision if you would go back to making that decision?
Yes, I would always make that decision again, because for me, doing my master's was infinitely beneficial. I moved from Germany to London. It opened a completely new international world to me. I met friends, students from all corners of the world. So in addition to learning something new, I also opened my horizons to different cultures, different ways of thinking. And I found arbitration on the way, while I was studying in London. But that had to do with the way the German studies are structured. Mm-hmm. So, I had to do what's called the first state exam, where I qualified as an undergraduate. And then in order to then do a practical training, which you need to do, kind of the equivalent of a training contract, right. You had to wait. And so I bridged my waiting time with the master's, and that helped me find what I wanted to do after I then qualified. Right. So that was really helpful. That might not be the same road for everyone. Mm-hmm. If you can afford it, if you have the opportunity, I would say always do a master's at some point. And I do think it's easier to do that straight after your studies than after you've already started working and then trying to go back into studying. I think it's also difficult. Mm-hmm. And I do find that it helped me finding a job when I had a master's to show for, especially, with certain focuses on arbitration and other things. And I was taken more seriously. And I do think law firms tend to potentially look as one of the criteria as have you done a master's or not. And so if you can do it, if you're able to, and if you have the means to do it, I always think it's a good thing to do.
Thank you so much for having this conversation with us. I'm pretty sure everyone watching this video will have taken away so much about your career and learned so much about your experiences. Now, to wrap it all up, what keeps you motivated? I mean, you've almost touched upon anything that someone would wish to do in the legal profession. What would you say is something that really keeps you going every day and motivates you to do more?
Interesting question. Different things. My work. I love my work. I love coming to the office in the morning, working on my cases. the next appointment keeps me going, the curiosity of what the next case will bring, who I'm going to work with, who are my co-arbitrators, which part of the world is it going to take me to. So those things keep me going. And the other thing is my daughters keep me going. I have 2 daughters who are 7 right now, and I want them to be proud of their mother, and maybe at some point when they're older look back and think, wow, our mother went to work, she did something she loved, and we want to do something similar. It doesn't have to be law, but something they like, and so that I want to in that way set a good example for them. So that's relatively easy and simple. And lastly, I'm a mentor in the Young ICA mentoring program, which I can recommend to all students who might watch, which is something I enjoy greatly, where, I have 4 mentees who I'm speaking to regularly about, career questions, legal questions, they want to know about arbitration. And that's something which is also very nice to be at the point of my life and of my career where I have something to give back to the next generation.
Right. I mean, that's very inspiring to know, because many students are afraid. I mean, even though it's a very, I think, futuresque question, it's a very, soon to think about what, would keep you motivated once you graduate. But they're always fearing the thought of, like, what if I get bored of it? Am I really doing the right thing? Or all of that. But, hearing your response to this answer, to this question is really going to, showcase that no, it's not just law that keeps you motivated, but it's everything else around it that keeps you inspired. Yeah. Thank you so much, Ms. Hoffmann. This was a very fruitful conversation to have with you. We learned a lot from you, and yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me, and I wish you all the best. Thank you.